my eyes off of him and ordered myself not to set them on him again in any significant manner or in any way different from the way I set my eyes on any of his presumably full-blooded Japanese classmates for the rest of his days in the school. But because of his blackness and my delusional pleasure at being around someone who I thought could vaguely identify with me, I had immediately taken a liking to him, which made it all the more difficult to treat him like everyone else despite my efforts. And I seemed to be having the same effect on some of the other students, particularly Terrence's friends. They tried to push us together at every opportunity. If I asked any of them a question, whether in Japanese or English, and Terrence happened to be in the vicinity, they'd turn to him as if to say, "Hey Terrence, any idea what this guy's rambling about?" They'd probably never seen him interact with another black person, so they were probably curious as to what would happen. Would Terrence suddenly shed this veneer of Japaneseness that he'd been masquerading since they met him and become the gaijin he appeared to be, the one that surely lurked within him? To be honest, after meeting him a couple of times on his own and seeing how Japanese he appeared to be, I secretly hoped the same. The first time I ran into him alone, I said to him almost instinctively, "Hey, what's up, Terrence?" "Ah, Loco sensei, ohayo gozaimasu." He replied, nod-bowed and smiled coyly and tried to keep it moving. It was typical behavior among most of the Japanese boys I'd ever run into outside of the school, especially the shy ones. But coming from Terrence, it felt cold and dismissive somehow. I caught up with him. I can be pretty persistent once I get an idea in my head. "So, Terrence, how do you like the school?" He donned a smile that cried, "If I weren't Japanese, obliged to appear polite, I would run away full speed from you right now." I'd see that face 1,000 times a day. It meant, among other things, he didn't know English. I stood there feeling silly. I only met one other black person in Japan that didn't know English. It had happened several years earlier. There'd been this girl, Hafu from all appearances, standing on the train platform near me. She was so beautiful, I wanted to propose to her right then and there. I told myself I don't deserve to live if I didn't at least try to talk to her. Hey, how are you?" I asked, and she looked at me the same way Terrence did. She told me in Japanese that she didn't speak English at all, but I had filed that away as she was trying to avoid being picked up. She'd probably been getting harassed by foreigners left and right, she was so fine. "Do you speak English?" I asked Terrence in Japanese. "Sorry, I don't." There was no guile, no shame. "Of what use is English to me?" I could almost hear him say. "Do you speak any other languages besides Japanese?" "Sorry, I don't." As I walked beside him towards the school that morning, 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but I felt uncomfortable asking any of them. It was none of my business, but curiosity trumped decorum, and rudely I asked, "Are you African?" In Japan, I've learned not so much that non-Japanese is a non-Japanese, despite what many non-Japanese here have said about the natives, that they don't distinguish between races, which is nonsense, but that black is black and white is white, etc. And though Japanese claim to be able to distinguish between Korean and Japanese, something I struggle with to this day, I've yet to meet a Japanese person who could distinguish between a mainland African and people of the African diaspora, or French and Irish, or Russian and Sicilian. Though there are many variations of black in Africa and in America as well, rarely have I been unable to ascertain at a glance whether a person was from my quadrant of the globe or from a nation in the motherland. I might mistake a Caribbean person, especially Haitian or Cuban, for African, but rarely an American. Facial structure is usually how I can make this determination, and Terrence's screamed straight from the motherland via Asia. As clearly his features were diluted by his Japanese heritage. "No, I'm not African," he replied, shuddering a bit. I was surprised at the response. "Where are your parents from?" I asked, and immediately regretted it. I could vaguely hear the echo of 1,000 Japanese people asking him similar questions, but with the obedience of the culture he'd been nurtured in, he told me that his father was Kenyan and his mother Japanese. He smiled again, uncomfortably, offering more than a subtle hint that I should drop this line of questioning if I have any sense of propriety about me. I did, so I dropped it. I would find out later in the school year from my co-workers that Terrence's father had gone back to Kenya while he was an infant, so he was being raised by his Japanese mother and, shockingly, a Japanese stepfather. From that point on, I rarely paid him any undue attention. I often go out of my way to interact with the students as much as possible for, in addition to making my work life more enjoyable, I told myself I was acting in a humanitarian capacity. The more kids that interacted with me and others who had chosen to spend their lives in this field and experienced that foreigners, and in my case, black men, were no more a threat than anyone else, the more likely that the future of relations here would be impacted positively, and the foolishness I endured would occur less often. But unfortunately, when I interacted with Terrence, I felt it prudent to be unfairly cautious. I surmised I could not treat Terrence as I treated the other students. Maybe it was one of the side effects of my having lived in Japan for so long. From what I'd learned of the Hafu's experience and from what I'd experienced as a foreigner and black man living in Japan, and from what I remembered of my adolescence, I presumed his life in Japan must have been and would continue to be an ordeal. And though I was very curious to know how he coped and would have loved to have offered him any support that I could provide, I kept my 2 cents in my pocket for his sake. It was hard enough for a teen to fit in. Even for a teen in a school in New York City, fitting in would be a dangerous balancing act. Even for 100% pure-blooded Japanese teens, I'd noticed it could get really tricky. So I knew I had better back off and let him make his way the best way he knew how. Besides, chances were, having been born and raised in this culture, he had a much better handle on the situation than I could ever have. But when I saw his face among the kids clamoring to chat with me that day, after my impromptu lecture, I figured he had to be curious about the language spoken in his father's homeland. It gave me a tinge of a feeling I wasn't particularly proud of. It wasn't pity, but it lingered in that same Pandora's box of useless, dehumanizing feelings that were better left locked away. Why? Because Terrence, as he'd informed me that day when I tried to pry into his business, was no more African than I was. In that Pandora's box were some painful memories of when I was a kid back in Brooklyn, younger even than Terrence. Back then, my friends would tease me. "Are you African?" they'd ask. "Hell no." "So why the fuck do you and your whole family dress like that?" Yes, indeed. Evidence to the contrary. On a regular basis, I'd be decked out in a dashiki and a kufi, while my friends in public schools wore whatever the hell they wanted to wear to school. I even had an African name, Baye, a name that my friends, with little or no effort or imagination, could turn into the most degrading jokes. What I never got around to telling my friends was that during my first week of school, my teacher told us that we must all choose an African name from a book of names. And for the remainder of our school lives, we will be known by that name. Why? I'd asked. Even at that age, I had an inquisitive mind and wasn't afraid to make inquiries. I was told that my name was a slave name, and that the true names of Africans brought to America in chains had been discarded like refuse and replaced arbitrarily by random, meaningless names befitting dogs in most cases, and their owners' surnames became their own. Little did I know how significant that moment would be. Not only would that name follow me home that day, but it would follow me into my life after school, and even until this day, it remains the name I am known by. Even friends I've had for over 30 years do not know my slave name. Why did I respond with hell no to my friends? Well, that's a little more complicated. Though at the time I was being taught to love and honor any African ancestry, I didn't exactly live in a vacuum. I watched a lot of TV and movies too. The images of Africa I received in school, of a land rich with ancient and advanced civilizations and natural resources, of kings and queens, of great empires and universities, were countered by the bombardment of negative images. It was those that influenced the minds of the people I had to interact with outside of this cultural sanctuary of my school. And unfortunately, I was influenced by these people and images as well. Of course, as a child, you don't question these images. Seeing is believing for the most part. I just figured that Africa was big enough for both the savage, cannibalistic tribes on TV and the advanced civilizations of my textbooks. Naturally, I wanted to be associated with the positive images, the flowing robes of princes and the kufi-wearing scholars. But unfortunately, most of my friends outside of school had no exposure to the positive images, only the negative ones. So I was subject to being called names like African booty scratcher, spear chucker, and monkey chaser by my own black brethren. Like Terrence, among those that were essentially my own kind, I was often viewed as abnormal. Naturally, I blamed the school. I blamed my school. This led me to resent the education I was receiving and even resent the Africa I was being forced to hold in such high esteem. And I would not have even an inkling of the enormous gift I had been given by my school until my first foray into the public school system as a teenager, where I would